Voice. There's the voice. Okay. And now we are on Facebook. Okay, we are ready to go. Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to History Matters. And so does coffee. Today we're talking about science. And as you're going to see, politics, culture, society, a lot of stuff about science, and how I think in one of the social media posts I put out there, I said people wanted to slug each other over science in early America, and it's continued on ever since. That's today's topic. But before I get to today's topic, I turn to my wonderful partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I am very excited to be here today. I want to hear all about science. We've been talking about that quite a bit in my family lately. So here's how this works. If you are new to us, please introduce yourself in the chat. If you have not been here before, we will talk for about 30 minutes. Joanne will talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll come back.
We'll talk.
And then we'll talk for another 30 minutes at least. But we would love you to put your questions that have to do with today's topic down in the Q&A. The chat is great, but it goes way too fast. The only way we can organize this is if you put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll be back in about 30 minutes to help field those. See you a little bit.
Okay. And as Annie just said, if you're new, be sure to say so in chat, because you will get a robust welcome for the wonderful History Matters community. And I think, unlike most days, I'm actually going to remember the number of the episode. I believe this is our 221st straight episode. So the community's had a lot of time to get to know each other. So let folks know. Okay, so the topic for today has to do with science. And normally most weeks I begin here and there's like some immediate thing in the news or that I read somehow that sparks the discussion. Today, I think it's just kind of more generally found its way into my head. And the question of science and how science has always been politicized, socially sort of deployed in different ways. I'm going to talk about politics. I'm going to talk about race. I'm going to talk about class. I'm going to talk about all kinds of things when it comes to science, just in early America, as a way to get to some insights as to how we think about it or don't think about it today. So obviously, you know, anything that I read on the question of climate change would have put me in this mood. The pandemic and the ongoing argument over things that should not be argued about over anymore about the pandemic, like New York's governor pondering if she's going to ban masks, which makes me want to punch a wall. And just the question of whether abortion is medical and is a procedure that people not only can choose, but sometimes really need. At any rate, obviously, science has been politicized always, but in the recent past to an extreme degree, to a harmful degree, and potentially even to a deadly degree. So this is what I want to talk about today. And as I'll mention in a moment, a book that when I was, I guess, writing my first book, sort of put into my head all of the really interesting ways in which we can think about science that we don't normally do. That science is political, is social, is cultural, and that it's easy to assume science equals empirical facts, right? That real science is facts and it exists in some kind of isolation, but it doesn't, right? That there is empirical science coming up with conclusions, and then there's everything around it, how it's interpreted, who did the interpreting, what people are considering, what people aren't considering, who gets included in studies, who gets excluded from studies. I could go on and on and on, but the point is, as empirical as good science can be, how we receive it, what we receive, and what is done with it can be deployed in endless, sometimes really not useful and even harmful ways. So I will say, as I plunge in here, the idea that science is politicized or that it has something to do with class and race, obviously I'm not standing here or sitting here, more accurately, saying this is a new insight. But what I am saying is thinking about the ways in which that has been true over time might offer some insight into ways in which, or things we can have in our mind as we confront science or scientific claims today. Okay, now the book that popped into my head when I first thought of this topic. It's not a book. I don't know how I came across it. It's a fascinating book. I remember telling someone at some point many years ago that I had read this book, and their response was, "Really? Like you read that book?" Because it was sort of like, what does that have to do with what you do? It's an intellectual history, and it's an intellectual history about science, really. It's by Stephen Shapin, Shapin, and I know that instantly it'll be appear at our chat, the book. It's titled A Social History of Truth, Civility and Science in 17th Century England. Now, I know I'm in England, I'm not in the United States or even just early North America. It's the 17th century, not the 18th century. But what this book talks about went on for quite some time. What the book debates, actually, it doesn't even debate, what it shows is that in that time period, when people were investigating science, there was a fundamental problem if one man, and typically what we're talking about here, gentlemen, right? Gentlemen had social authority and could make claims that were going to be believed. If one gentleman made one scientific claim and another gentleman made a different scientific claim and they conflicted, this was a problem because it was personal. It wasn't just, oh, we'll disagree, because essentially one of those men would be calling the other man a liar, right? He would be saying, I did an experiment, this is what I found. And if someone else says, well, no, I did an experiment and that's not what I found, instantly, in a way that has really fundamentally to do with reputation and honor and all the things that I write about in my work, instantly science becomes personal, becomes an issue. And that's why the word civility is in the title of this book, because civility was, there are many people trying to preserve civility in the discussion of science, and it was being challenged time and again because claims conflicted. That fascinated me when I read that book. That even, and this is the period we're sort of moving into the Enlightenment. And obviously, as we've discussed here before, during the Enlightenment, there's this assumption that if you look at either all of history or if you look scientifically at the world, you can come up with universal principles, universal ideas that can change the way we act within and understand our world. And you can see how science is a big part of this. This is sort of at the beginning of this wave, but it's a point that I certainly hadn't thought of before reading this book, which is that these and what's interesting is this morning when I was trying to, I couldn't find my notes on the book because I took those notes probably in like 1998. So I have no, they're probably on paper in New Haven right now. But at any rate, I was trying then to find things around this book that would sort of, I could weave in. And I'm looking up science, 17th century controversy, science, 17th century fight. And again and again and again, I'm trying to get into the fundamental point here, which is that it wasn't some disembodied abstract idea in this time period, as much as people were trying to find abstract factual ideas. It was profoundly personal, bound up with civility, also bound up with class, right? That elite gentlemen were people who, first of all, were assumed to be civil. When they weren't civil, there was dueling to help them out. And in this case, if you call someone a liar or if you suggest they're a liar, then a duel is hovering. And again, a duel, when you're dueling, you're saying that you are refuting a charge that is worth dying over, right? Someone calls you a liar and you end up fighting a duel. What you're saying is, I am risking my life to prove to the world that I am not a liar. That gets bound up in this as well. So personal, social, it has to do with authority, it has to do with class. All of this was bound up. Now I'm being bad like my students. That's embarrassing. Okay. I normally remember to turn off my phone. So all of that is bound up, even in the 17th century, with science, how it's received, how it's used. Now, given that general idea, I want to move ahead in time into the 18th century to a specific incident that really shows all of this on a sort of ground level. And I'll make a few suggestions here about things that might be useful in a classroom situation. I'm very proud of myself for having thought of this, but well, I'll come to that when I come to that. What I want to talk about here briefly is the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 in Philadelphia. So this was a severe epidemic. Yellow fever, you don't want to get it. You had fever and chills, and your skin got jaundiced, and you had severe stomach trouble and vomit tinged black with blood, delusions. It was horrible. Yellow fever is horrible, and a lot of people died. I even have a figure here. According to one onlooker at the time, out of a population of 50,000 in Philadelphia, about 17,000 fled the city, 17,000 of 50, and 4,000 died, maybe 5,000. I'm going to come back to that point momentarily. But at any rate, really severe. It was a real epidemic. The elite were the ones who fled the city because they had the means of doing so, and they were fleeing in droves. And actually, I can't resist. So Alexander Hamilton actually got yellow fever, and was cured. I'm going to come to the politics of the cures momentarily. But by this point, 1793, Hamilton and Jefferson are really not friendly. And so Jefferson, first of all, comments that he doesn't think Hamilton really has yellow fever, that he's probably just being a hypochondriac. And then he says, this is a quote, "A man as timid as he is on the water, as timid on horseback, as timid in sickness, would be a phenomenon if the courage of which he has the reputation in military occasions were genuine." Like, the guy's a coward. He's a weakling. So, and we're seeing it here. He's like claiming yellow fever and he probably doesn't have it. So that's a snarky Jefferson moment. But at any rate, bad things in Philadelphia. People are fleeing. Hamilton gets it. Ultimately, the Hamilton family flees. They go to the Schuyler family in Albany. I seem to remember that before they were allowed into Albany, they had to burn a lot of their belongings so that the fever wouldn't travel with them. But here's where things get interesting, or more interesting, because the cure for yellow fever became, surprise, surprise, highly political. And remember, certainly at this point, if you've been here the other 220 times we've been here talking, the 1790s is an extremely, extremely partisan era, Federalists versus Republicans, a lot of similarities in the strife and violence and fear about the collapse of things in the 1790s and some of what we're feeling now. So extreme, extreme politicization of everything in the period. You ended up with a Federalist cure for yellow fever and a Republican cure for yellow fever. Now, as far as the Federalist cure goes, David Hosack and Edward Stevens, both doctors, and Hamilton grew up with Edward Stevens, who he called Neddy, in the Caribbean. They were both friends. So on the one hand here, they're going to sound humane because they believed that quinine and wine and cold baths probably could help with yellow fever. Benjamin Rush had the Republican cure for yellow fever, which involved purging and bloodletting and was a lot more extreme. But here's where we flip. So the Federalists seem like more men of science, right? They have a calmer and more user-friendly mode of attacking this fever than the Republicans. However, Federalists largely believed that yellow fever probably came into Philadelphia, the United States, with immigrants. Yep, it was the immigrants bringing bad things with them. The immigrant problem, right? Surprise, there's a problem, and everyone points to the immigrants, or at least the Federalists did. The Republicans thought that there was some local cause for it. No one really fully understood the cause of it, which was largely mosquitoes. Took a while. I think 1901 was when they figured that out. I don't know. Don't fully believe me on that. It's a hunch. But at any rate, yellow fever becomes extremely politicized, and which cure you pick, the Federalist cure or the Republican cure, was assumed to say a lot about your politics. So not only might you be dying of yellow fever, but you have to think about which cure you want to get and what the implications of that may be. Again, to an extreme degree that from the distance of time seems ridiculously stupid. It's like, just get the cure that you think works. But no, politics infused everything. So, for example, you might walk around without a mask during a pandemic because, politics, wearing a mask. Ooh, that would be a liberal thing to do. We'll come back to that. But at any rate, you can certainly see how political this was and how profoundly personal it was, because you're talking about a life and death situation and you're deciding on medical care because of it. Now for the social dimension in it, that beyond the idea that it was the elite people who could afford to flee and who fled. So that's one social component. But here's another one. Benjamin Rush erroneously thought that Black Americans were immune to yellow fever because, of course. So he and others urged Black people in Philadelphia to stay behind and act as nurses, help people who were sick, act as grave diggers, right? Just be there since you're naturally immune to yellow fever, which they weren't. And indeed, many Black Americans stayed behind and risked their lives to help others. Now, interestingly, the numbers I quoted a little while back, I'll come back to them here, that there were roughly 50,000 people in Philadelphia. People estimate 17,000 left the city, 4,000 died, maybe as much as 5,000. Here's the thing about deaths of Black Philadelphians at the time. We don't know how many of them died because nobody was keeping track of them. So there were a lot of Black deaths, and maybe I won't say nobody was keeping track. People were not keeping track in the way that they were keeping track of the deaths of other people. So one of countless holes in historical evidence because of assumptions at the time. Okay, so first of all, obviously, this question of science is social because now it involves race. Now it gets even more social. Once the fever had passed, a Philadelphia newspaper editor named Matthew Carey wrote a pamphlet called A Short Account of the Malignant Fever Lately Prevalent in Philadelphia, one of those great 18th century titles. And in it, he essentially accused the Black community of profiteering off of yellow fever, that nurses were like charging more than they should, that in one way or another, Black Philadelphians were finding ways to, illicitly or improperly get money from taking care of the white Philadelphians who stayed behind, which is pretty slimy. In response, two men wrote a pamphlet. These two men were really noteworthy, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Both men were born into slavery. Allen bought his freedom. I think Jones was manumitted eventually. They were born into slavery. They went on to become extremely prominent public figures. And they came together to defend the Black community from what was said in Matthew Carey's pamphlet. They wrote a pamphlet titled A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censures thrown upon them in some late publications, in particular, Carey. So here we have two prominent members of the Black community in Philadelphia stepping forward and in print saying, you're just slandering and slurring us for no reason other than racial reasons. You're lying. And we're going to stand up and we're going to refute this in a powerful kind of a way. So here we're seeing so far, right, the yellow fever epidemic clearly politicized and political to the point that there are different cures depending on your political preferences, clearly social, elite people leaving town, and in the sense that it becomes racial as well, racialized as well. All of this from, a medical emergency and people claiming, right, Rush and Stevens and Hosack were claiming that science proved that what they were doing was correct. And they were believed in one way or another because they were elite gentlemen of education who were making these claims. So they would be seen as figures of authority. All of this in this crisis over yellow fever. So, in a sense, just a great example of some of what I'm talking about here when I say that science is not ever in a bubble of isolation apart from the social and the political and the personal and class and any number of other things, even religion. I didn't even go into that, but you can wave that in here as well. Now, before I go on, I do want to say, because this is where as I was preparing my notes this morning, I thought that this might work for teachers. So many of the people here are teachers. I have not done this myself, so I leave this to you, but both of the pamphlets that I talked about here by Carey and by Allen and Jones, they're all online in one way or another. They're 18th century things. So in one way or another, you could find them online. So you have a short account of the malignant fever by Matthew Carey, and you have a narrative of the proceedings of the Black people during the late awful calamity by Allen and Jones. I think it would be fascinating, depending on what you find in those pamphlets, to look at some of what Carey charges and to look at some of what Allen and Jones say in response, and to look at what that suggests about society, about in Philadelphia, about the world for Black and white people at that time. That could be really a really interesting society, to the point that society, really interesting assignment, a really interesting thing to do, to the point that I'm intrigued to see if I could do that in one of my classroom situations, maybe my lecture course next semester. That would be really fascinating. And it would be doing something that is not always easy to do in the 18th century, which is having two Black men saying in print in a published pamphlet what they want to say to this white author making false charges. Okay, so that's my classroom idea. All of this, everything I've said here, is part of my initial claim. Claims about science are framed and bound by questions of politics, by questions of culture, by questions of society, class, race. I didn't even get into gender, but you could throw that in here as well. Claims about science are surrounded by and bound up with all of these things, which nowadays, in a way, it's hard to forget given some of what's going on. I'll come back to that momentarily. But it's important to remember, because I think it's tempting in a general kind of abstract way to think that, science is fact equals abstract. And how we get it and how we understand it and who we get it from and what we believe or don't believe, all of that is pretty malleable. And all of that needs to be remembered when we're thinking about what we're reading and scientific claims that are being made now. Some of this has to do with trust, right? Who do you trust or who do you not trust? Nowadays, obviously, with some people, shall we say, discrediting experts of all kinds as, oh, what do they know? They're experts. They're, people with big glasses who know nothing about the masses and the truth. If you are politicizing expertise as being something elite and liberal, then you're putting yourself in a situation where you're not going to trust certain people who probably at least ought to be considered trustworthy at the outset. Always evaluate what you're told, but now we're at a moment where expertise is being discredited, and poof, now the question of science becomes social and political and personal. Obviously, questions about science are highly politicized, just in the realm of climate, just in the realm of the question of abortion, and even on the most basic level, what some male politicians claim is true or not true about women and their anatomy and pregnancy. I'm not even going to go into that, but we have all, I'm sure, seen some of the claims that are, what? You think what? Really? And you're going to tell me Whether I can or can't have an abortion with that kind of a lack of knowledge, no. But regardless, we live at a moment where everything is highly politicized and bound up with class and extra bonus bound up with gender and race and everything else, and has a deadly component to it. People might not want to think about that, particularly in the case of climate. In the case of abortion, to me, it's hard not to think about it, but I think people still think about the climate crisis in an abstract way or deny that it exists at all. And that's not abstract, and it shouldn't be abstract. And I know that there are scientists out in the world pulling their hair out at the fact that the crisis is real and people are not only not paying attention, but refuting it. So when we think about science, when we think about scientific claims, when we think about people denouncing scientists and science, first of all, I encourage you to do what I always encourage us to do almost every week, which is consider what you're reading, who is saying it to you, how and why they're saying it to you. Always question the sources. Folks here, you're either teachers or people who like history, or people with just intellectual curiosity, and all of you know, question sources. Always question sources, but give credit where credit is due. And remember that when we're looking at arguments over science, what we might be seeing is not about science at all. It can be about our society and our politics and what's going on all around the scientific claims. In some ways, at some times, conflict over science is more about power than it is about science. It's more about who has power and what they're willing to do or what they're willing to surrender or deny to get and keep that power. Never forget that that's an enormous part of science as we understand it. Ultimately, part of it is about power, and you need to consider who has it, who wants it, and what people are willing to say or not say, or outright deny to get and keep power. Okay, look at that. Just almost on the dot, done. Okay, now let me mug. Thank you. I get this is before we started. I think I was talking about how every once in a while, when you stand up in front of a class, the class magically gets quiet and something's wrong because they're not being noisy. And I feel that same way here. Is that when I stop talking, if no one says mug, I feel like right, something's wrong. Where's the mug? Okay, so today's pardon.
I was saying mug, mug, mug. So
Thank you. I need it.
Like you can show it.
I need it. Okay, so this is on multiple levels. It has to do with science. It is one you've seen before, but you haven't seen it in a long time. It's a Carolee mug. It is. The many brains.
Oh, yes. I love that one.
Now, brains, we're talking about science. Brains, we're talking about evaluating science. And I just love this mug. And it was actually like, it had something to do with what we were talking about today. I will read you what it says on the back. There's three different, I guess, tweets that it has. It says, one of them says, historian brain. This is fascinating. Non-historian brain. Another says, I have a quote brain, letters and writings from early-ish America stick in my brain. That's an understatement. And the other one has a jingle for chewing gum from the 1970s, at the bottom of which I say, why does my brain remember these things for decades? I don't know. At any rate, that's the, I think, fully appropriate mug for today. Science.
That is a great mug.
Okay, now I will open chat and stop talking and we can have a conversation.
Okay, well, the chat is always very active, but today I kind of felt like I could not read fast enough. I don't know if anybody else felt that way. It was just so fast today. So I'm not going to be able to look at that right now because we've got tons of great questions. And I'm going to start. Sydney has a couple of questions. She wanted to know how the I cannot say that word, politicization of science and science education differed from early America versus the present day? Why has science always been politicized?
Well, in a way, it has to do with what I said at the end, with science is politicized in part because it does have to do with power, right? Even if you just look at the yellow fever example, right? Someone has the right answer, someone has the wrong answer. The people with the right answer get authority and credibility, and they're considered important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What the first half of the question was what?
She wanted to know how the politicization of science and science education differed between the
Right.
founder era and now.
Well, as far as education goes, um, obviously a big difference would be that women didn't receive education in science or many other things as well. It was not necessarily considered something that everybody studied. That said, it was something you could study to some degree in college. Actually, I've always found this fascinating. You may or may not. Um, Alexander Hamilton goes to King's College, now Columbia, and he's from the Caribbean and he's sent on charity and he doesn't have a lot of resources. He's kind of hanging on. And in Hamilton mode, Hamilton was a very plan oriented person. And when you understand how he thinks, a lot of things in his life make sense. And this is one of them. He goes to King's College and he does several things in a very categoric manner. He takes anatomy courses and is interested in science. He shows himself to be religious, right? He sort of presents himself as someone who's religious. He joins a debating society and is taking part in, learning about rhetoric and debate. What he did was try to train himself in every profession that might make him a gentleman, right? I could be a lawyer. I could be in the clergy. I could be a doctor. I'm going to cover all my bases. So it was very deliberate, and medicine certainly would have been one of those things. A lot of people, at least for a time, like actually Hamilton's friend Edward Stevens, he's sent to Scotland, to Edinburgh, to go to medical school. Science is another one of those realms in which, like many cultural aspects, the assumption was, for good reason, Europe is where all the knowledge is, right? Europe is where like the scientific equipment is where some of the new discoveries are being made. That said, North America had all kinds of natural history things that were being discovered and propounded. But a favorite Jefferson fact of mine is, he so wanted to be part of that scientific community and conversation in Europe. He would buy, and of course he could because he owned a plantation, he would buy scientific devices that he heard about in Europe. He would buy them and have them sent to Monticello. And in some cases, the people who work at Monticello have discovered he never opened the box. He just wanted access. He just wanted to know that he could see and use these things where he was, which again gives you a sense of the United States versus Europe. And also, again, how science was seen as knowledge, but was developing in the United States in a different way than necessarily than it was in Europe. Eventually that gap kind of closes. But that's part of the answer to Sydney's question.
So now I'm imagining Monticello, the front porch with a bunch of Amazon packages. I think it would be fun for kids to do like Amazon rating, like how was your delivery?
Well, then the question is, who steals the boxes off his porch?
Did Jefferson have a Ring doorbell?
Right.
Okay, Sydney had another follow-up question.
One quick thing. I do want to say Benjamin Franklin, I haven't even mentioned. How could I not mention Franklin? But obviously, man of science who gained worldwide notoriety because of that. It's goofy that I didn't even mention him, but that was, one of his main claims was that. And he all by itself, his scientific exploration and discoveries, really worth delving into. I should have mentioned him and somehow or other didn't. And Ellen Cohn at the Franklin Papers at Yale, if she knows anything about this, will be very unhappy with me for not mentioning it, but Franklin very much deserves mention.
Sydney wanted to know about, would the Scopes trial be considered an example of politicizing science?
Well, politicizing, well, it's about politics for sure. It involves religion as well. It involves culture as well. So it certainly is an example of all of the framing around questions of science that make it difficult for people to actually wrestle with realities, right? What does it mean if you believe in evolution? Well, that's a religious problem for some people, so they're just not going to believe it. Where are they putting authority? Well, they're putting more authority in the religious leaders that they want to follow, or in the political figures who believe those religious leaders, than they are necessarily putting in what people of science are claiming. So that's a great example of the give and take and push and shove of different views and ideas surrounding questions of science, for sure.
Yeah. And Jacqueline Hauptman is asking about the AIDS pandemic. You know, she said it seems like some scientific issues depend on who's being affected. And she mentions the ACT UP organization that kind of fought back about the politicization of the, you know, not doing enough early on with AIDS. She was wondering if there's other historical precedents for grassroots efforts by ordinary people to bring attention to scientific issues, trying to wrestle it away from the privileged class.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I wish I could. I'm not going to be able to instantly poof come up with them as I wish I should. It always takes me longer than I wanted to come up with stuff like that. But for sure, that would be an ongoing thing. The AIDS crisis is an example in part of people coming together to make demands about what should happen, and celebrities also stepping forward and showing their sensitivity to it, or revealing it, maybe not with or without their permission, that they had it. But there's a case in which people were just interested in denying it, obviously, or in claiming it was like a curse from above to curse people who were homosexual, and that was the logic behind it, and science had nothing to do with it. So that's another great example, like the Scopes trial, of things that it's an illness. People need to work for a cure. It had symptoms. It needed to be dealt with. And some people were so incapable of getting that point, and so guided by their fears and prejudices and social assumptions, that it clouded even a major crisis like that. I mean, again, years from now, when people write about the pandemic, they will be saying, look at how clouded people's vision became during an obvious health crisis, that people, even as they lay dying, denied that it existed. Look at how clouded people's vision was, and then think about what that says about the power of the assumptions people have about politics and society, how scared they are of some things, or how adamant they are to not believe some things. So when the AIDS epidemic or the pandemic, those are moments where, when you see people behaving in a manner that absolutely contradicts not even abstract, detailed scientific evidence, but just the fact that it's a disease, and people are acting in ways that say more about their fears and prejudices. Sadly, as a historian, that's a way that you can tell a lot about a society. If I were in the future looking back to this moment, that would be this moment in time. I would use the whole pandemic as a way to get at the culture and politics and economics of our current moment. Because what people did or didn't do, or believed or didn't believe, on the highest levels and the lowest levels, says a lot about what people believe and where they are. And that's generally true, but we're living in the middle of a moment like that.
Okay, Kathleen wanted to know if there's any background or history on how religion and science became so polarized or at odds. Why does it seem to benefit to have those two kind of duking it out over
Well, I'm sure that there actually is scholarship, and I'm going to count on the people who are, again, zipping along in chat while I'm chattering here to come up with it. But, the problem with religion and science is a question of partly authority, right? That religious authorities want and claimed to have the ultimate power. And if science refutes that, or science challenges that in some way, what did Jefferson had a name for the clergy. I'm not going to be able to remember it, but he basically thought that, like, the clergy, which he largely thought, New England Federalist clergy, they were like a squadron of people who were dedicated to, like, closing people's minds to anything except their authority and God's authority. And so anything that contradicted that was not going to be included. And then, of course, that becomes politicized because those clergy tend to be Federalists, which is why Jefferson's peeved. But at any rate, religion, because of the question of God and God's role in humankind, human existence, the way things happen or don't happen, human will and how much our will has an impact, the power of the clergy and of religion to control society, the power that it does have or the power that it should have. I mean, religion too, in one way or another, established religions have to think in one way or another about power too, right? To stay in existence. Some more than others, when a religious affiliation becomes more centered on power than it does on spirit, that seems to me to be a big problem. But I'm not going to go further than making that statement for the moment.
All right, we've still got a ton of questions. Okay, Gloria wanted to know if there were examples of history, just history in general, being politicized. I think there's probably a million.
Oh, yeah.
But it's good to have Gloria back. We haven't seen Gloria in a while.
Oh, no, for sure. History, the telling of history is always politicized. Because again, what the story that you're telling gives certain people power and takes certain people out of power. A great example of that, I don't say that to praise myself, but it shows this in an extreme kind of way, is the epilogue of my first book, that talks about how people were telling the history of the founding and how one person would say something. Oh, I see. Lost cause. Yeah. If you want to talk about the politicization of history, just think about the South and the idea of the lost cause, or the idea of putting up Confederate statues in public places as a claim of power. But even just in the telling of seemingly abstract history, you can look at all of these people writing and refuting each other, and it's basic, what we would take as basic scientific claims. But yes, any history, in a sense, I don't have to say this to this group of people, but history, in a sense, is the most politicized of all, because history is the story of how we got to where we are, and who has credibility and who doesn't, and who has power and who doesn't. And depending on the history that you tell or don't tell, you can eliminate people from history and from power, right? So the telling of history has to do with who we are. And that's why, we're in the moment we are now for that reason as well, right? That certain kinds of history that have to do with race, suddenly we're not supposed to be talking about them. That the books have something to do with homosexuality in some way. Oh no, we can't talk about that. That there are any number of different topics that now are suddenly deemed like they shouldn't be talked about. That's a way of eliminating people from conversation, from public consciousness. That's a way of claiming, in a seemingly indirect, but actually pretty darn direct way, that these topics aren't worth considering. So that actually, it's a great question, because that's one that's worth looping back on and talking about again, the politicization of history and over time. I don't remember now who just said cough, cough, lost cause, cough, cough, but that's a great example of that. Yeah, we may have lost, but it was a noble and worthy fight. It was the lost cause, and we remain true to the noble and worthy lost cause, which happens to have been a war to defend slavery. But hey, no, it was a noble lost cause. History as a weapon deployed by people who want power, that's big. And oh, okay, there you go. I didn't mean to insult you. Is that Jim Downs? Is that like the person I know?
Dennis. James Dennis.
James Dennis. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, James. I didn't mean to eliminate you at all. I just, it was a good point. And I'm crediting you with a good point. Okay.
So kind of a follow-up to that, Jenny G asks, depending on who wins or attains power in the future elections, is that going to decide how we write the history of COVID? You know, the anti-vax folks get power. Is the official history for future generations going to get written in such a way that it, you know, downplays it or further politicizes it?
So on the one hand, yes, depending on who has power, that will affect the official account or the account that is allowed to be taught in schools, potentially. Here's where, and I didn't, James, thumbs up. I didn't mean to upset you at all. But here's where attacks on higher education and professors come into this picture, right? Because if you have tenure, people think that, or some people think that tenure is just about like, I have job security. The logic of tenure is that before you have it, you really have to worry about, in one way or another, writing things and doing scholarship and doing research that will get you attention, that will get you credit, that will show your skills. You're not free to do whatever you want to do, or be as free as one might be to do whatever you want to do, because you are thinking about job security. Once you have tenure, the idea is you can then research as your heart desires. You can research things that are unpopular. You can research and draw conclusions that people aren't going to like. Universities, sometimes that's bad and we don't like what people conclude, but sometimes, often, what professors are doing in research universities and other kinds of universities is doing research that nobody else will do to show things that people don't want to show. That's why often in authoritarian regimes, you attack universities, you arrest professors. They are dangerous purveyors of knowledge, and you got to shut them up. That's what tenure does. So in the future, depending on who has power, will there be people claiming in one way or another that, blame this all on the fill in the blank? Yes. Will the teaching about this moment be politicized? Probably. Will we know actually what happened? Well, that depends on people who can come forward and really do that research and speak a truth. And that partly depends on freedom of speech, freedom of learning, society, schools, institutions of higher education in which people are free to pursue research in a way that can offer, create, discover, and spread new kinds of knowledge. So that's, I didn't think I'd be talking about tenure, but I think people are so bound up with, you privileged people, tenure is just about not being able to be fired. No. And I can say, as a person with tenure, I didn't judge my research as like, well, people like this. But once I got tenured, then I realized, oh, well, now I can actually really do what I want to do. And what is that? Is there something I want to investigate that I didn't think about before, or that seemed too hard, or it was going to take too long that I didn't do before? And tenure is bound up with the pursuit of knowledge in many cases as well.
Yeah. The chat is crazy, and
I can see, man, it's going along. Yeah.
Okay, so we have this is a very long question.
Okay.
This might have to be broken down to pieces. This is from Frida from Erie, Pennsylvania. She says the Raheny decision rejecting limited ability to restrict guns from domestic violence. Roberts had interesting comments explaining that since the founding, our nation's firearm laws have included provisions preventing individuals who threaten physical harm. And then it says he applied the facts of the case, the Pistol Association versus Bruin. They said Judge Roberts wrote, some courts misunderstood the methodology of Second Amendment. These weren't meant to suggest a law trapped in amber. She said he explains it would be to protect muskets and sabers. And she wanted to know what you think, how this would get to the bump stock decision.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I would say that's not quite on the topic of science per se, but it is an example of people, originalism, an example of people, looking to a document written in another time with different forms of technology available and different conclusions about possibilities, and somehow or other making a claim for now grounded on a piece of technology that is different now from what it was then. So, it's interesting. It's an interesting question because, well, we saw originalism also badly used when it comes to abortion. Right? Oh, this is what happened. It's like, no, it's not what happened. Did anyone in the Supreme Court actually consult a historical expert on abortion throughout American history? Boy, that would have been useful. So, in a way, this is a great example of the power of originalism. In the case of guns, though, it does relate to what we're talking about today, because we are talking about technology and big claims made about a technology today grounded on assumptions and possibilities and impossibilities that existed in the 18th century. So that in and of itself is an interesting conflict, and is one reason of many why originalism is really problematic. And this is it's a great, because technology is involved. It's a great example of that.
And I also think that the gun example, it's the mental health piece of science.
That's true.
Who we allow to have access, and it's not, your rights versus the safety of everybody else.
Right. No, for sure. I also, someone in chat is going to be able to tell me, because I have no memory. Who wrote What Hath God Wrought? The big book in the Oxford series of books. Can someone tell me that? What hath God wrought?
Come on, Tim. We knew you had that link.
I know someone out there can get it for me. Well, while we're waiting, I mention it, What Hath God Wrought? It's a book about largely the 19th century, but part of the main argument of that book is technology and the way in which technology. Daniel Walker Howe, thank you very much. Yes, that is precisely the message that Morse sent, and that's why it's the title. It's a book that talks about how technology fundamentally changed everything in the 19th century. So related to the topic, I recommend that because it's really interesting reading. Telegraphed it, yes.
Ellen wanted to know, is there anything still in existence at Columbia University, or King's College as it was, referencing Hamilton, or are there places where, they kind of cite his presence there? She's in Alexandria, and she said there's all kinds of places that say George Washington slept here, sort of a thing. But did they do the same thing for Hamilton there? She's wondering.
Well, certainly his name's all over the place. I mean, I know there's Hamilton Hall. I know there's Hamilton statue. I know that in that way, Hamilton's all over the place. I also know that the Hamilton Papers, the published edition of Hamilton Papers, came from Columbia. So that means, his papers were collected there. They have all kinds of Hamilton artifacts there. I don't know, because I don't know what survives at Columbia from, the early, just after the middle of the 18th century, whether there can be a, Alexander Hamilton stood here kind of thing. But certainly in Manhattan, there's like plaques that say, actually, Emma here again, who there you go. Emma says, come to Lower Manhattan. I know there's a plaque that says, Hamilton's house or law office was here. So New York has those kinds of things. I don't know what of that sort is at Columbia.
Yeah. All right. What was the public's response to Carey's pamphlet and to Allen and Jones's pamphlet? That's a question from Thaisa.
Oh, interesting. So what did Carey say about
they wanted the public response to Carey's pamphlet and then the Allen and Jones pamphlet. Like, how did the public perceive these publications?
Oh, well, the Carey pamphlet, making all these charges about Black Americans getting money off of the plague, that was very popular, not surprisingly. And when the refutation was published, the original pamphlet was in its 4th edition. So it's selling like hotcakes. And that's why these two men stepped forward and said, Allen and Jones said, yeah, okay, now we're really tired of this. So the public, of course, bought into the original argument. What I don't know the answer to, because I didn't research it before talking to you here, I don't know what the response was to the Allen and Jones pamphlet. That would be worth looking up and seeing. The fact that it was printed in pamphlet form and sold in and of itself is really interesting, but I don't know like how well it's sold. I have never looked to see if people were commenting on it. And if you were interested in that, you could, if you had access, for example, to a newspaper database like America's Historical Newspapers, you could, frame dates from this year to this year and then search on the title or the two men's last names and see what comes up would be one way to kind of see if there's public debate. That's, as someone who's always interested in my work and public opinion of things, often political things, I very often am doing like strategic newspaper searches to at least get a sense about what was floating through the public mind. And you wouldn't necessarily be able to, conclude this was this popular in a specific way, but if it's buzzing around in the newspapers, then you at least it was a topic of public debate in some way.
All right. Dave asked, what role, if any, did religion play in fights, duels, arguments, politicization of science, especially in light of how the framers dealt with religion in the Constitution?
Well, religion was everywhere. Religion was everywhere. Religion wove itself into everything, and again, was often perceived as a power struggle, right? That people who are studying science perhaps are challenging religion. In the case of dueling, it's really interesting because on the one hand, you have honor culture that says, men should defend their honor when attacked. On the other hand, you have religion saying that dueling is immoral, that it's murder. And then you have people wrestling with how to sort of defend honor while not being bad Christians. Hamilton, what he decides to do in the duel is partly a response to this precise problem. He decides he is going to duel to defend his honor, but he's not going to shoot at Burr because that's not what a Christian person would do. Bad strategy to take when you're fighting a duel. But I think in the chapter on dueling in my first book, Affairs of Honor, I talk about this idea, good Christian duelists, right? That people were desperately trying somehow or another to get religion and honor culture to overlap in some way. It was really hard, almost impossible, but they were trying. So certainly it was bound up. And some people who fought duels, actually, if I remember correctly, when Hamilton lay dying, there was one member of the clergy who refused to come to his bedside because he had fought a duel. Yeah. So very, very much bound up with religion. And in this case, it was, entirely personal and also social because only elite people got away with dueling. The law givers could break the law, right? Other people got thrown in jail.
Just like nowadays.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one question left. I know it's exactly 11 o'clock on the dot, but you know how much I love to clear the deck. So Greg asks, did you find any examples of African-American physicians present in early America who could argue against claims of African-American immunity to yellow fever or something on a medical basis? He said he knew French medical schools admitted individuals of sub-Saharan descent at this time, which was a shock to many American students attending there, that they would allow the sub-Saharan Africans to be there.
I don't know if the answer to that officially. I can say that there were certainly Black men of science or Black men of learning who were out there trying to find their way into the public sphere. I mean, check out Benjamin Banneker, a Black man who writes to Jefferson, right? Says, I'm interested in this and I'm creating almanacs. And he's someone who is in that realm and writes to Jefferson, and Jefferson writes back to Banneker a letter that's, sort of vaguely patronizing, but like, what a fine thing it is that men of your sort, blah, 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 blah. And then he writes another letter to a friend of his that says, there's no way Banneker did any of that by himself. Right. Someone else clearly did it for him, which just tells you about Jefferson. So certainly, there were, I don't have the specific details. So I would suggest yet another topic worth delving into. What I love about the conversation and being here is that every single week I'm like, I don't absolutely know the answer, but this could be another episode. And then somehow every Thursday I'm still struggling to come up with episode topics. So I don't know what that says about me, but still. I like how Lauren said good Christian men let's duel is one of his favorite holiday carols. Yeah, it's a long lost one. Okay. I am gonna do what we need to do towards the end. Did we clear the deck?
We cleared it. Yay.
Oh, wow, that was perfect. Okay.
No.
So here's what's going to happen now. We're going to go to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording our conversation, so we could be even freer and easier than we were before, which I always sort of internally laugh at that because it's not like we're being like stiff and formal, but still. And if you beamed in through NCHE, stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. As ever, freer and easier like we are. Well, we are freer and easier with tenure, but people who are struggling to get tenure, I can't rejoice in my tenure. I can't because of the many people who are being denied it. But that's a topic for another day. At any rate, thank you all for coming, for participating in the conversation of democracy wherever it may lead us. I, as ever, have no idea what we'll be talking about next week, but I bet many of you didn't expect science. I didn't expect science before yesterday. So you never know where it's going to take us. And in one way or another, it's got to help us in the present day. So that's part of the goal, is to talk about our current moment and democracy. We will always find a way. And just our being here and engaging and asking questions and even disagreeing with each other, it's a wonderful, wonderful demonstration of democracy in action. Okay, I also want to say thank you to Zabo. Thank you to Claire. Thank you to Annie and Jessica and John and NCHE for making this possible and being the best of best colleagues. Everybody have a very safe week. Be well, stay cool. Yeah, everywhere. I don't know where it isn't going to be really crazy hot, but at any rate, thank you guys for coming. And I will see you guys in a week.